Another big night for Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, who more and more look like they could be the two to face off this coming November. We're going to be talking about that and some other aspects of the campaign as well in this first portion of the program tonight with G.M. Cox. He's an assistant professor at Tarleton State University. He was a police chief in Texas in the towns of Murphy and Corsicana for a number of years, and we'll address some of those issues that apply especially to his background in a moment. But first of all, noting that Hillary Clinton has won tonight in Florida, North Carolina, and Ohio. She's now leading in Illinois, but it's close. And Bernie Sanders is leading slightly in Missouri, although that remains pretty close as well. For Donald Trump, victory is tied in Florida, Illinois, and North Carolina. John Kasich did take his home state of Ohio. He's staying in. Missouri still up in the air, Trump leading slightly over Ted Cruz, and the thumping that he got from Trump in Florida has left Marco Rubio to withdraw from the race with notes in his concession speech that we should not submit to fear in this country. He did not endorse anybody, but certainly not Donald Trump. G.M. Cox, thank you for being with us tonight.
Glad to be here.
Your thoughts about what the voters have said this evening?
Well, I really haven't followed that much on the political scene. I think it's interesting. Made some commentary on it on a blog that I actually control through the Tarleton MTA blog. But I think it's interesting that the voters are seeing it this way. As Mr. Trump has said, there's a lot of frustration out there. People seem to be voting for the non-establishment candidate. That kind of tells you the pulse of the nation, and they're pretty fed up with politics as usual.
Mm-hmm. That certainly would seem to be the overriding theme that goes through all of this. As a matter of curiosity, for those of us not that academically inclined, what exactly is an MPA program?
An MPA program, probably one of the best ways to describe it is like an MBA, but for people who work in the public sector.
So what, Master of Public Administration, is that what it stands for?
Yes, sir, Master of Public Administration.
All right, very good. Now, your time as a police chief, the Murphy Police Department until July of last year. Before that, more than 15 years as the police chief in Corsicana, Texas.
Yes.
And I'm thinking of the job that local law enforcement has at political gatherings because, of course,
right.
We have the sometimes robust way that people express what they claim are their First Amendment rights in this country, sometimes trying to cut down on the First Amendment rights that they may feel others do not have. And that's always a tricky line to balance if you're a police officer, right?
It is. I think we see our roles. We have to see our roles as being people who protect the public peace, protect the freedom of speech of both the one who's giving the speech, those listening to it, and those who want to protest based on that person's speech.
I'm wondering if you have any guidelines, like, for example, when you were at these departments. Those don't sound like large police departments, and I'm sure you don't have major support teams in place and the like. But I wonder, for example, if the state of Texas offers guidelines, because certainly police officers, naturally, traditionally, their first order of business is to keep the peace, stop disturbances and the like. By the very nature of protests, there is a certain level of disruption involved, and it's a fine line. And of course, when you are a police officer, yes, you have extraordinary powers of arrest and so on. You also face extraordinary responsibilities, and you can get in a heap of trouble if, as a police officer, you cross some line out there. So I'm wondering, as you have sent officers out maybe to cover such things, if it has happened in your time in law enforcement, what instructions do the officers have out there other than, don't let anybody break any heads?
Oh, through my 40 years as a police chief, or as a police officer, 34 as a chief, I had many opportunities to have political rallies, both at the state level. Had visits from the governor. Actually had George H.W. Bush visit Corsicana, and create quite a stir, if you can imagine. But so I think all police departments believe that their responsibility is public safety, but at the same time, we can't be seen as gag orders on freedom of speech. So We try to walk a fine line between keeping the peace and letting the person say what they want to say. But there's some bright lines in Texas, as well as throughout the United States. We listen to incendiary speech that would lead one person to react violently to what's being said. Clearly walks across this line. We call that speech that tends to incite a riot, or speech that creates a breach of the peace.
Yeah. In fact, I understand at least one police official was talking about the thing maybe had Donald Trump had engaged in speech that would lead to inciting to riot, this sort of thing. That's I'm not sure what the proper definition of that term really is, particularly in the light of today's standards on what constitutes political speech. How do you decide if one person's righteous anger is somebody else's incitement to riot?
That's a great question. I think what we have to do, we do a balancing act, but here's the most important part. The speech of the speaker is the one that's important, not the speech of the protesters per se. So in this case, the protesters were counter-protesting. So they were predisposed to disagree with everything that Trump said. In addition to that, we already know that the protesters are being sponsored by two major groups, Black Lives Matter and MoveOn.org. And they are playing basically by the handbook that those two organizations provided them. So they're very confrontational. I saw the news report of the Chicago riots, or what you want to call them, last Friday, and you could clearly see the protesters had a slant. They were in your face. They were disrespectful. They were flipping people off, even on camera. And if you put your face into another person's face within an inch of their nose, by definition, that person has a right to believe that they have some safety concerns and get that person away from them. So I think when we start looking at what language crosses that barrier, I've listened to most of his speeches, and yes, he says some things that I wouldn't agree with, you wouldn't agree with, many of your listeners wouldn't agree with, but he has a right to say those things. And you have a right to respond, but you have a responsibility to respond within the law.
Yeah, and it would seem to me, again, as no lawyer, but as someone who has certainly been around the law and its applications as regards the First Amendment for many, many years, it would certainly seem to me that the Move On and Black Lives Matter groups crossed way over the line, that it wasn't even close, that when you show up with a point not to be heard but to shut somebody else up, and you deliberately try to provoke problems, then as far as I'm concerned, then the whole lot of them should have been arrested.
And many of them were. I think what the police are trying to do is not make a judgment about the speech or the content of the speech. Even the protesters have a right to protest. So the police are trying to keep the peace, separate the parties, make sure that no violence occurs, people aren't seriously injured. And I think the Chicago police actually made a comment that they were totally prepared and had the number of police officers they needed to keep Mr. Trump and his people that came to the rally to hear what he had to say safe. On the other hand, Mr. Trump decided, for one reason or another, to cancel the rally. Now, whether he did or did not speak to the Chicago police, that's for evidence later, because one side of the story is saying he did, the other saying he didn't. Matters not. The point is the protesters are bringing the, I guess you'd say, the confrontation to the Trump rallies. Mr. Trump, on the other hand, is not really vetting the people that come to his rallies. So one could argue that he maybe could do a little better there. But on the other hand, he's a politician. He wants the opportunity for the persons who may not even believe or agree with him to hear his message. Maybe he can convert them.
Yeah, and again, I don't know if anyone advised Donald Trump to cancel a rally. I would think, frankly, that is an abdication to the forces of intimidation if you cancel a rally like that. My thoughts are that the police should come down on the side of letting it happen. And again, if somebody is out to provoke trouble, I'm not sure that the police have the power to keep that from happening, other than to simply say, okay, you wanted trouble, here it is. You're under arrest.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the police department, depending on the state, every state has maybe a different set of laws that allow police to exercise police power in advance of a criminal behavior act. So if they felt that there was an extreme amount of danger, maybe they could do that. But this, Mr. Trump, he rinsed the venue. I'm sure he pays a deposit. He gets his permits from the state, city, any entity that requires him to get one. And that pretty much makes him and his rally a legal event. And then you've got the protesters. I'm sure they got their permits. And they came and they were told to stand in a certain place. And when they chose not to do that and became confrontational, they certainly crossed that line. But the police are going to try to handle it in a very informal manner unless they have no choice. A couple of those people crossed that line. They had to be arrested, and they were removed from the rallies. But you see they're basically operating the same handbook that every police department is going to use throughout the United States.
G.M. Cox is an assistant professor at Tarleton State University and was a police chief in the towns of Murphy and Corsicana, Texas, for a good many years. And we're talking tonight, of course, as Super Tuesday 3, I guess it is, has now been largely wrapped up. A man rushed the stage while Donald Trump was campaigning and was grabbed by Secret Service agents. The protester was arrested and charged with disorderly conduct and inducing panic. But as Director Clancy put it, the point of the Secret Service is to protect the candidates, not stop protests. And he added that local law enforcement and campaigns make the decisions regarding protests. Your thoughts about this, Professor Hall? Or Cox, pardon me. I'm sorry, I had another name in front of me here. Professor Cox, please go ahead.
Well, I agree. I think the Secret Service's job is to protect that protectee. They're going to create a perimeter, and most people will not even see it. They're very good at their job. So their perimeter will be set. Usually they use a four or a box formation, and depending on how big the crowd is. And their job is to protect you. They cannot be worried about the speech, protesters, et cetera. So they're going to protect the protectee. And local law enforcement job, along with Mr. Trump's security people, and I'm sure he's got them, they're all coordinating everything they need to do. And I agree with you in your earlier statement. They can't be seen to acquiesce to the wishes of MoveOn.org or Black Lives Matter. They have to be, as a matter of fact, they may be even getting the kind of response that's going to help Trump in a lot of ways, because now they're making him look like the victim, and victimology tends to bring a certain amount of sympathy. So some people who might not have been a Trump supporter may, in fact, be swayed by the behavior of these protesters.
Anybody can sink below the level of maturity, and unfortunately that can include law enforcement. I can recall back a good many years when some inmates at the one of the federal buildings in Washington, D.C., they were in a holding cell, and somehow they got loose, and they actually took control of the basement. It was a federal courthouse. Mm-hmm. And so while there were day-to-day activities taking place on the main floor of that courthouse and above, but in the basement, you had this siege going on. Now, when it was all over with, this was, of course, a federal building, and Washington, D.C. is a place that just has jurisdictions everywhere. There are something like 36 different types of police in that area. Right. But at this point, there was some question about, what happened on a sidewalk as these inmates were being taken out, and they were in their underwear and restraints, some kind of chain type of thing. And there was a dispute between the federal officers and the D.C. police. And it actually led to a fist fight. And you actually had the spectacle of these two inmates sitting there watching this spectacle. My point only being that sometimes federal and state and local officials don't get along. Have you ever seen examples in which, in a situation that can be tense, like, say, protests at a campaign, that different jurisdictions may have gotten in each other's faces?
Well, absolutely. I think, and I don't know that I've ever seen them go to blows, but many times you're going to have jurisdictional differences. You're going to have people that come in and say, this is our jurisdiction. You're going to say, no, it's not your jurisdiction. The federal government and the state police and local police have very definitive jurisdictions. For instance, coming into a local or like a city, the federal government doesn't have a right to enforce local law, doesn't have the responsibility to do so. And matter of fact, the local law enforcement tell them, you need to back up. It's a concept known as posse comitatus. So, and that also means that local law enforcement are really cleared to enforce federal law. So we have a very clear difference. We have a very clear demarcation between local law enforcement and federal law enforcement and who has jurisdiction. First off, the federal government's they have to have a law that they can enforce before a federal police officer can get involved. In many cases, they don't have a federal law. So, and D.C. is interesting because it's the District of Columbia, and the law-making body is Congress.
Indeed. Recalling back a few years, I saw a documentary recently regarding the assassination of President John Kennedy. What many people may not realize is that Lee Harvey Oswald, or whomever, we won't get into that tonight, but the killer of John Kennedy did not break any federal law at the time.
Correct.
There was no federal law against murdering a president. He broke the Texas state law against murder. And there was an effort made by law enforcement in Dallas to keep the president's body around. He was, after all, a murder victim. They wanted to do an autopsy. Lyndon Johnson, somewhat understandably, not knowing exactly just how far this extended. Was there a plot underway? Was there an attempt to behead the government? And he is now the president of the United States. He wanted to be sure that could not happen. And so what happened was the Secret Service simply took John Kennedy's body and left, although technically they had been ordered not to do so. So anyway, these things can happen. Again, tonight, a big night for Donald Trump, winning Florida, Illinois, and North Carolina. John Kasich wins Ohio. Missouri is a close one. Trump leading Cruz there. For the Democrats, Hillary in Florida, Ohio, and North Carolina. She's winning Illinois closely, and also Missouri. Sanders ahead. Back in a moment. Thanks for being with us on the Jim Bohannon Show tonight. 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. And the Tuesday that is super is, well, for the third time so far this year, is going as follows. For the Democrats, Hillary Clinton has won big tonight, the two biggest prizes, Florida and Ohio. Add to that North Carolina. She has about a 4-point lead in Illinois with 63% of the vote counted there. Bernie Sanders is leading her by 2 points in Missouri. About a third of the vote has been counted in Missouri. But any way you slice it, that's a big night for Hillary Clinton. For the Republicans, a similar big night for Donald Trump. Florida, and it's winner-take-all. 99 delegates go to Trump big time over Marco Rubio, who bowed out of the race this past evening. He did not endorse anyone, certainly did not endorse Donald Trump, with references to how the American public should not fall prey to fear and similar comments. Trump also takes Illinois and North Carolina, where Ted Cruz did fairly well, but not quite well enough. John Kasich won Ohio. He stays in, clearly hoping for more Midwestern races, Wisconsin, places of that nature. The state of Missouri, not only is it currently going for Sanders, it's going for another underdog, possibly, in that Donald Trump is ahead by less than 1 percentage point over Ted Cruz, who has been gaining all night. So at the current pace of things, we can't tell where the votes are coming from. But if the current trend held up, then Cruz would probably overtake Trump in the state of Missouri. But any way you slice it, Trump and Clinton, big winners this past evening. Looking ahead to where we'll be going down the road. We'll give you a little preview of that coming up as we continue to talk with G.M. Cox, an assistant professor at Tarleton State University in their Master of Public Administration program. He was a police chief in Murphy, Texas, and Corsicana, Texas for a number of years, and we've been looking at some of the problems that have happened at the Trump rallies in particular. And, of course, you've got Donald Trump's often inflammatory rhetoric coupled with groups who are certainly no stranger to that notion themselves, the Move On group and Black Lives Matter group. And so this was almost, I guess, ready-made. I'm wondering, Professor Cox, in that regard, I think, for example, back a few years, I was working in Chicago, and I covered a situation where everybody knew it was going to be major confrontation time. This was when a pack of American Nazis, who I think it turned out to be more like about 4 or 5 of them, showed up in Skokie, Illinois, which of course is the home to a lot of the descendants of Holocaust victims.
Right.
And their whole point was to be as nasty and confrontational as they could be. They tried to be. Now, needless to say, there's a large Jewish population there. They were not amused. The police searched them, but I can guarantee you that the minute they had kept the Nazis inside some kind of a shelter house, it was in a public park, and when they emerged, I mean, it was like a full-fledged artillery barrage. I didn't see any hard objects like rocks, but I saw a lot of eggs and other things. I mean, it just came pouring down on these people. Now, the police made an effort to try and control the situation. They made an effort to search people and stop the importation of missiles, if you will. But this was a case where the police, number one, knew what was coming, and number two, pretty much, I guess, knew they weren't going to totally stop it. What do you do in a case like that when you're going to lose, and you just, I guess, you hope that things don't totally get out of hand?
Exactly, Jim. What we try to do, we know we've been put in some very between a rock and a hard place, to use a Texas term. Sometimes you just inherit a bad deal, and you got to make the best of it you can. I've had KKK and I've had counter protesters been the New Black Power Black Panther group in the same place at the same time. So you've got to worry about, well, them being in the same geography is not even a good thing. But you can't, as police, you've got to have a very specific reason to deny or have a permit denied. In this case, it probably was manageable. We knew it was going to be confrontational, and you mentioned Skokie, Illinois. I've actually been there, by the way. It's a nice little community. They knew there was going to be a confrontation, and then the officers have a duty to protect, so they're going to do the best job they can. And they may not even, people say, well, how can you protect this group? Police officers aren't allowed to ask that question. We do our jobs whether we like who we're protecting or not, whether we like what they're saying or not. We don't have a right as police officers to make that decision. Those decisions are made by other people. Our job is to try to keep it as calm, as safe as possible, and ensure that people have their rights and that their rights are exercised.
Yeah, and that's something that seems to be so hard for people to understand these days. I can remember back in the Jurassic era of American K through 12 education that I remember getting courses in civics, and I was actually I had things explained to me like the First Amendment, my right of my fist stops short of your chin, this kind of statement and the like. I don't know what they teach these days, but there clearly is in this country a major lack of understanding of just what the First Amendment really constitutes. I blame that on a number of things, which really we don't need to get into, I suppose, tonight. But suffice it to say that the police certainly understand that they've been given the fine points of the law. You can go this far, you can't go that far. I wish the public learned more about just exactly what's actually involved in our, quote, rights, unquote, because these days you get people who seem to say, well, I want to do that, therefore it's my right.
Mm-hmm. You're right. We don't really get that anymore in school. I wish we did. I kind of encourage all the young students that come to university. I say, take an intro to CJ class. At least it gives you some idea of what your civic responsibility is. How do you live with other people that have different opinions than you? And they express theirs, you express yours. The old saying is, don't talk religion, don't talk politics. But life is all of that. So we've got to figure out how to live with each other, have differing opinions, and part of it is civility. We talk about rights and we talk about privileges, but there's also responsibilities, and that is not to violate another person's rights, to be willing to listen to the other side without immediately demonize them. By the way, there seems to be a lot of this going on. If I don't like your speech, I'm going to demonize you. We particularly see it coming from actually both parties. I've seen it on both sides. So you see a little bit of that going on. But you're absolutely right. There's not enough civics education going on, police officers, and sometimes we don't even have a good grip. The Supreme Court has made decisions about what is freedom of speech, what is freedom of assembly, and what crosses over. For instance, no one can walk into a theater and yell fire. The Supreme Court and reasonable people would say that's dangerous. But at the same time, I can talk about fire. People can actually stand on the U.S. flag and that's freedom of speech. So we have to, there's a fine line. We have to balance interests.
It is not an easy thing to do, and especially for the police. We're going to come back and talk some more with Professor G.M. Cox of Tarleton State University. Jimbo with Professor G.M. Cox of Tarleton State University, a man whose background includes being a police chief in 2 different Texas towns, and we've looked at some of the problems they have faced. Danny calls in tonight from Boston, a WRKO listener. Hello, Danny.
Hey, how you doing?
Fine, thank you.
That's good. The question I was going to pose, I was a police officer in Boston, Massachusetts for 22 years. And there's a lot of crowd control that we have to do. And the best way we found about it is just horse patrols. And it's not intimidating. The horses are trained. And, unless they get stabbed or something like that. I saw that happen one time. But it's just, it'll break up the crowds because, you see this 1,200-pound horse coming at you, you're going to suddenly break up. So,
and let's face it, if you are, in fact, not a person who's been around a lot of domestic animals, they are intimidating, even if there isn't an effort to make them so. It's a big critter, and I grew up in farm country. I've been around horses all my life, but if you don't know, that's a lot of meat coming at you.
Naturally, that's, okay. When I first started, they had horses around, but the population in Boston wasn't all that great. So I guess they got to get used to the, horses, just kind of like, riding around and stuff like that.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
But in Boston, they have a lot of concerts, they have a lot of basketball games, they have a lot and that's all crowd control.
Yeah.
Same thing with the the Republican and Democratic, conventions or rallies or whatever you want to call them.
Sure.
But it's just, if you start the crowd control before it gets out of control, then that's probably the best way to go about it.
Yeah, good points, Professor Cox. Certainly in Texas, you know that as horse country. Have you ever made use of horses in crowd control situations?
Absolutely, Danny's absolutely right. You take a 2,000-pound horse, about 16 hands high. Well, it makes them right about 5 foot tall at the back, and you put a police officer on top of that. You've got a very psychological advantage, and that's what we want to create. Police use horses. I've used horses. I started the mounted unit in Corsicana. I'm reminded of one of the best mounted units I've ever seen is actually Smith County, Texas. They actually came to Corsicana to help us out when we had a KKK rally, and then we had a counter protest by the Black Panthers. They lined up about 10 horses across the courthouse lawn, and they actually moved about a 45-degree angle, and those horses actually almost walked sideways. And you talk about clearing out a riot. It put an end to it pretty fast. They're very impressive.
Yeah. Anything else, Danny, you'd like to offer tonight?
Naturally, they're very impressive and very intimidating. But, if people get used to them, as long as you don't spook a horse, then they're definitely fine.
Yeah. Well, these are trained animals, of course, but they're also animals. And as you note, an overt attack on one, striking one, or as you mentioned, stabbing one, you never know what's going to happen. But the intimidation factor, that's a good thing. It's not like this is some official police bullying or something. The idea is don't mess with us. Just calm down. Our guest, G.M. Cox, assistant professor at Tarleton State University, a police chief in the Texas towns of Murphy and Corsicana. You mentioned it would be good if, in fact, people could have an introduction to criminal justice course. That would be very good. I would like more jurisdictions to use something that I once took part in, which I understand has now been canceled, and that is the ride-along program. It was canceled in where I was living at the time, Montgomery County, Maryland. I found it quite instructive. I think they may have broken a rule on one particular point. I was riding along. They got a call of a domestic violence charge, and they showed up at an apartment, and they actually let me come along, and being a nosy reporter type, I went, and I watched, and I saw something that's nothing new to you, but I think a lot of people would have been surprised. The typical story, woman getting beaten up by her husband, calls the cops show up, they're separating the two. I'm off in the corner right by the door watching this, and the guy ain't taking it too well. So the police are taking him away. Now the woman who was getting beaten up, who's just had her tail saved by these police, now she gets into the cops' faces. And I remember thinking, good grief, who would want a job like that? Your thoughts?
I agree. I've had the same experience myself. I remember when I was a deputy sheriff in Montgomery County, Texas, as it turns out, responded to as a matter of fact, in this case, it was a reporter was the victim of violence, family violence. Her husband had strummed her up pretty good. We ended up having to get into a confrontation with him, took him to jail. The next day, she filed a complaint on me. So I certainly understand. It seems to be a no-win situation. And you're right. God bless those people that that think that they can be police officers and stand the line. We call it standing the line between the good and the bad, and being willing to face danger to keep everybody safe.
We had, of course, a case of a Prince George's County, Maryland police officer shot the other evening. It turns out apparently he was shot by friendly fire, but he was shot because a pack of low-life punks chose to, for no reason, just start shooting up a police station. And this has become altogether too common in this country. It's bad enough that in your day-to-day existence on the job you may wind up getting assaulted, but when you have a risk of actually getting murdered on the job, that's not acceptable.
It's not acceptable, and we've got to do something about it. Just today, we've had a Fort Worth police officer got shot, and we had one 2 weeks ago got shot in Euless, Texas. So a lot of officers being shot in the United States, a lot of them being fatally shot. And in this case, we had a police department being shot up. McKinney, Texas, had an assault on the police department a couple of years ago. You may remember that. Fortunately, when they constructed the building, they made some plans and had a lot of the glass was actually Lexan bullet-resistant glass. So we see a lot of it. I think there's some frustration out there. People are being led. And you talk about some of these the rhetoric that's inciting people, Black Lives Matter can be a little bit, if you look at some of their rhetoric, one could argue that some of the reactions could be even worse in what's coming out of their rhetoric.
Yeah, absolutely. I just saw something the other day. Apparently Ford is selling police cars now that have some kind of armor built into the sides of the cars. They say it'll stop a 30 caliber rifle round, like an AK-47 round or a deer rifle. I guess I always kind of thought that maybe police already had that, but I guess not.
No, most of our cars are not bullet resistant. Now there are certain features that make them. They tend to put thicker metal in the doors. They took and put reinforced fenders. These are primarily reinforcements for accidents. We get hit a lot, and we hit other people a lot, not always on purpose, but sometimes on purpose. So those were the strengthening of the vehicles are primarily to protect the officers inside. But there's usually a partition between the back seat or the prisoner transport area and the officer's driving area, passenger side. Those are usually bullet resistant, and I actually had a vehicle shot up 22 times.
Wow, unbelievable. We must pause on that note. Stay on the line. We'll speak off air. Again, G.M. Cox is an assistant professor at Tarleton State University, former police chief. In tonight's Super Tuesday results, big night for Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. Marco Rubio departs the race, and more details coming up here in just a moment.